Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we're going to be looking at all the new balance changes that just came out today. They're live on the new server. We don't have any nerfs this time around. This time around, the focus is on a number of really cool buffs that are going to be specifically for giving us some fancy new toys to play with for deck builders of all stripes and sizes. There is primarily a focus on bringing Aurelion up into the meta, or specifically Primal, Shadow, and Time. Not necessarily Aurelion. There's not that many actual like relic focused or like specifically 3-color cards that we're looking at, but we do have a bunch of cards out of some of the previous sets that are getting buffed up to what I would say is a much more competitive level, and these are a lot of cards that actually have some really fun abilities attached to them, some really good gameplay. These are actually cards that we've played with a lot in previous brews that have never quite made the grade and never quite been good enough to brew for like tier 2 or tier 3 lists where you can actually grind with them. So these are cards that I'm really happy to see buffed, and basically it's just this giant toy box. We're going to be talking about each of these cards in turn, and yeah, like overall it's pretty much all good news. So first things first, Alu Death Dreamer has gone from a 5-cost 2/5 to a 5-cost 3/6, which amongst other things makes it much better in the limited environment if you pick it up as a legendary, but that's not a particularly big deal. The main thing here is that Alu is now much more survivable and actually has enough damage to push across while flying to sort of actually end the game in a situation where you have a lot of control happening with all of your curses. Typically you had to rely on actually getting some unseen to get that random battle skill out, but now like if you actually have like the additional Nightfall, if Alu is the only card left on the field, it's probably going to actually push for the win, you know, in a couple of turns. It's not going to be a huge amount of turns, it's not going to be a very good clock, but it's still enough that it's better than like basically a 2/5 would be, of course. Yeah, the difference between 2 and 3 is very serious on flyers, and this actually allows this card to really be something of a damage dealer, as well as a much more survivable card that allows you to play those curses much more often. More unseen is always good. We're actually seeing one other unseen card getting buffed here, and let's go to that one actually right now. Zeliha the Vain has gone from a 4/4 to a 4/5. I would say this change is more exciting since Zeliha was already a relatively competitive unseen card. Not like particularly great, but something that really belonged in a lot of unseen focused decks in Mono Shadow, especially with the Deadly Confrontation, the 4-cost card that kills units and then allows you to exhaust unseen to kill even more units, allowing you to get some pretty significant card advantage in Shadow, as well as a lot of good removal. So yeah, Zeliha is a really strong card overall, but was always a little bit capable of getting blown up. I would say that this is definitely going to help the card quite a bit in terms of giving it a little bit more oomph, and also with some of the new cards in the new set, specifically Porcelain Mask, to give this card overwhelm. Like you've got some cool basically like new options to play around with this card and give it like some interesting bond effects. I think there's some decent stuff here if you want to play relic-based stuff with a lot of extra power, so you can play multiple afflictions. If you want to play curse-based focus with Alu, that's something that Zeliha can now actually do. Like I think there's a Zeliha Alu deck that people have probably been sitting on for a while that we're going to be seeing brought out into the forefront over the next couple of days, and maybe it'll actually get to see some play. I'd be excited to see a competitive unseen list. Okay, Blackhall War Leader is up from 2/2 to 2/3. This card has always suffered from being a 2/2. It's a pretty decent effect, like a really powerful Inspire in fact, but obviously having to hit the enemy player is a pretty significant problem, and since the card is well capable of just like not doing anything on board or just trading with a 2/2 and not really being all that aggressive or interesting, when basically every other 2-drop 2/2 has like a war cry or some sort of effect where once it attacks it will get some sort of benefit at the very least, like it just wasn't really on the competitive list. You saw Blackhall War Leader in a couple of different decks, and there were some interesting decks that tried to use it, but it was frequently the worst card in that list. I think this changes that quite a bit. Now not only does the card allow you to defend a little bit better against aggro lists and also play yet another 3 health unit at 2 in Shadow, along with like Archimport Instigator and a couple of other like fun aggro setups, but this card actually just survives a little bit better, and the trade ability means it's much more likely to actually attack in, get that first hit, which then gets it up to a 3/4, makes it torch proof, and allows you to get the second hit and the third hit and the fourth hit and so on and so forth. Basically, Blackhall War Leader is much more likely to become a threat because it's much less likely to trade with whatever unit your opponent puts down down on 2, meaning that playing it first is pretty likely to guarantee you an Inspire, as long as the card does not get torched. And if it draws a torch, it's a 2-drop. That's usually pretty good, because there are a lot of 3 or 4 drops that you maybe don't want to get torched. Speaking of which, Governor Sahin, a card that just really didn't do a lot, has gone from a 3/3 to a 3/4. Card is now torch-proof. That's pretty important for basically a card that needs to stick on board to get any value. Governor Sahin basically can't be played as like a 7-drop, unlike most cards that have these types of effects where you get to pay a little bit of extra, because primarily you don't really need to pay 7 for a relic when you can already pay 7 for a relic. Like if you want to get a Zendil's Gift out early, then, you know, Governor Sahin has to actually stick on board, and then you have to wait 1 turn and then pay another 3. So with this, Governor Sahin is much more likely to actually stick for that vital turn, and then you can sacrifice a relic to play something big like, say, a Zendil's Gift, or the card Nametaker, which I am very happy to report has also been buffed to a 7/5 from a 6/4. Yeah, so this actually puts this not quite in like sort of the Sky King territory, but it does put it in a bit more competition with, say, the last word for a big relic weapon finisher in Shadow. Now you can actually pick up a lot of the bigger cards, anything with 4 attack or more, which is pretty frequently a thing, as well as, you know, picking up 2/2 drops, or basically just allowing you to get anything and still have a little bit of an extra charge on Nametaker to maybe get more than 1 copy of something with Nametaker. Since this card has like a cranial extraction type effect, I can see this being played in some Argenport like hate decks where you're running, you know, the Caltrips, and probably not Caltrips, but Avagraft and Citywide Ban and Nametaker. You could do Primal with Rain of Frogs. You can do a lot of like things where you sort of hate on your opponent's stuff. Don't go too overboard with this. Typically shutting down your opponent's deck by just extracting out all of the good cards can be successful if you stack it all up enough, but I would say the main thing here is to get rid of their biggest threats, and then have some threats of your own to sort of compete with that. Maybe we'll see a competitive list. I'm a little bit worried that this card might be a little bit toxic if it's combined with a lot of the other effects, but with Avagraph seeing a recent nerf, I don't know if that deck's going to be competitive or not. And of course you can run this within Cold Blood, you know, all sorts of different types of effects. I think there's a few too many of these effects on board right now, but I've always been down with Nametaker as one of those effects because it's just a little derpy, it's a little expensive, and it's a really fun finisher. Doing this at 8 doesn't feel as bad as doing this at 4 does, and it's just kind of an interesting card. This is also Shara's gun, by the way, like you'll see it in her art. So fun things, good to see that card getting a little bit of a buff. I'm very happy with it, although I'm a little bit worried that, you know, if it ever does become competitive, that might be a thing that could cause some problems. We've also got some Wisp buffs. Entrancer has been increased from 3 to 4 for the Summon Silence effect. And this is actually kind of a really cool deal because Entrancer now hits cards like Sandstorm Titan and Vara Fate-Touched. Vara Vengeance Seeker. Which Vara Vengeance Seeker is a particularly good hit if you can get it with an Entrancer, because it turns that card from a recurring threat with lifesteal and potentially deadly that can be played down on an empty board as a 5/6 for 4 to a blank 4-cost 3/4 vanilla unit, which is really quite a change as far as things go. And if you're using Entrancer to front a Wisp deck, this is something that's going to add a lot of power to this list. I think 4 Entrancer and Wisps is definitely going to be a real thing. I think 4 Entrancer in other types of decks where you're actually trying to mess with your opponent's strategy might actually be a real setup, and this card might see some play in some competitive lists that want to shut off those cards that cause so many problems for them in the early game when they're trying to get into later control. It's also a 1/1 flyer, which isn't really a big deal, but if you're playing like straight counter spell control and you want to shut off some stuff while also having something to fly across, maybe you got something here to play with. I don't know if this card's going to be amazing in non-Wisp decks, but I can see it seeing a little bit of play in control lists where previously it would not have seen any play before, and that's kind of cool to see. Combined with Porcelain Mask, and you can silence a lot of cards in your opponent's hand very early. There's a lot of annoyance mechanics in these buffs, and that's something to keep an eye on. Hopefully it won't make the meta difficult, but we will see if it's going to be an interesting change or not. I really think that it's overall a very good buff to Wisps, and there's one other buff to Wisps that also makes Entrancer much better, which is Soulbringer. Soulbringer is up from a 0/0 to a +1/+1, which is to say it's now giving play a Wisp from your Void and +1/+1 to that Wisp. That means that since most Wisp decks were already running 3 to 4 copies of Soulbringer, we now have an inevitability engine in the form of Soulbringer that we didn't have previously. Typically what you needed to do with Soulbringer to actually get any benefits out of it was you had to get some sort of extra buff off of cards like Pathlighter or the Duskwisp, the 2/2 unblockable that buffs things in your Void, both of which were not easy things to do. Now, just by virtue of bringing back Wisps like Entrancer and Spitefeeder and other small flying Wisps, you can actually get some pretty big inevitability, and this card will overall like start to buff things up to like 4/4s or 5/5s before the game is out, especially when you're bringing it back constantly with Dark Return, possibly even the well, Back for More or other interesting shenanigans. There's a bunch of interesting possibilities to bring Soulbringer back, and yeah, this adds a lot of like inevitability to the deck. It really makes it a very Void-focused list that can be a lot of fun to play, and I think there's a really good Popper Wisp list that can actually be a good ranked grinder now, and that's a really, really good setup. Hopefully this will add some strength to the Wisp deck. It's a really interesting archetype. I'm glad to see some actual power being brought to the list, because previously Wisps really just didn't have it, and yeah, there's been a lot of Wisp decks. People like playing with these cards, and I think this is a really good buff overall. So I'm not maybe looking forward to hordes of 4/4 flying Wisps, but I will probably be playing a few of them myself, so can't deny other people their fun. Alright, Ava Islands Elite, 4-cost 3/4 now instead of a 5-cost 4/5. The next section of this is all cost reduction. In particular, we are getting a buff to Ava, we are getting a buff to Veteran Mercenary, and we're getting a buff to a couple of other interesting cards. This one is a bit of a side grade, not too bad, but I would say that like since this was a 4/5 before and now it's a 4-cost 3/4, so like it's gone down 1 and it's gone down 1/1. But overall, like I would say that this is a pretty good buff to the card in general. So now you're pretty likely to get the tribute for this. It's probably much more ranked playable because it does draw you 2 cards effectively on turn 4, while also getting you a flyer that is capable of scrapping with basically any other flyer. Most flyers are going to be typically in the 3 attack range and typically won't have more health than 3. There's a lot of 2/3s, there's a lot of 3/3s. You don't see a lot of competitive ranked flyers that are a lot bigger than that. There are a few, but not too many, and most of them are like very particular cards like Impending Doom or the Shelterwing Rider, which hasn't been seen play in the Vara landscape. So yeah, this card is pretty likely to get on board in the first place with the tribute, which means that you're going to get 2 free cards to discard or play into other types of effects. I really like Ava and Feln Cauldron together. That's always been a kind of a delightful way to play like an interesting weird rank shenanigans deck. But you can also do like a lot of other things to discard and also trade this card out into the market, which is particularly critical because getting Cloud Snakes to trade into the market for like Geneb Merchant is effectively just really, really good card draw. So yeah, that's something to keep an eye on. I think this card actually has a lot more ranked playability as a result of this, and also it's still a draft bomb. It still does a lot of ridiculous things in draft, and like it's a pretty good thing to be playing on 4. So overall, this card has definitely seen a significant buff and is a limited bomb as always, even if it doesn't have quite the same amount of push and quite the same amount of scrappiness as Ava at 5 necessarily did. I would say being faster and still getting you those Cloud Snakes means that it's still just going to be as terrifying, if not more terrifying and limited, and ranked playability has gone way, way up. Let's try Hideaway. This one's, I would say, more focused on limited than ranked, although there is some potential. I mean, it does specifically buff a elf deck in ranked where you are now getting, instead of paying 4, you can pay 3 to give one of your elves plus 2 strength. So yeah, like basically I would say this is more important in a limited format where you're very likely to actually get that sort of benefit on elves than in a ranked format where you are typically going to be playing this card specifically for Zende the Heartbinder, which cares about elves and cares about relics at the same time. However, like the cost efficiency increase is beneficial for ranked and is going to add a little bit of power to the list. I would say it's much more important in draft where actually having the ability to constantly buff up your own elves. Play this on, in particular, the 0/3 Lethrai Courtier that is just like rampant in Aurelian and a really, really strong card that doesn't get to attack in and turn it into a real unit. Basically, this allows you to do something pretty effective on multiple turns to actually add inevitability to elves that are not playing aggressively. So that's pretty cool stuff overall. Elf control definitely has like a lot more strengths as a result of this, and look out for this card in Zende lists with ranked setups, because I think that's going to be a pretty big deal. But I would say that mostly this card affects just like, it's much better uncommon to pick in draft as a result of the fact that you can use that ability much more frequently, and that will add a lot more power to your board overall. All right, another one of my favorites, Sleepless Night, has gone down from 8 to 7. This card has always been something that I've wanted to cost 7. I play this in the market quite a bit, actually. It's a really fun market card overall because it effectively allows you to take a hand that has nothing and turn it into a hand that has something, and then turn it into another hand that has something later on in the game. Typically, I would rate its effectiveness at around 4 cards per 7. Like, you can get 8 out of it because you can discard, you can play all of your cards and then you can discard your hand after drawing it, but of course you do have to discard the cards that you're playing before when you play Sleepless Night, since you have to discard your hand to draw the 4 cards, and you also have to discard the hand that you drew if you draw Sleepless Night in later turns. So yeah, I would say like 4 to 8 cards are all possible, but for 7 that's still a pretty good amount of value, and this is a really good way to add like basically a top end to a shadow list with a lot of shadow merchants, or to just basically like really create some interesting draw opportunities in Vara focused decks and like these sort of Fate Touch Reanimator style lists. This can be something that actually allows you to, at the end of the game, discard a pile of cards that you don't want, draw yourself into a Grasping at Shadows, do all of those interesting shenanigans. I love this card a lot. I think at 7 it's actually very, very powerful. I expect to see it in some ranked lists, and I hope that people get to play around with it a bit, because it's definitely really cool in Revenge lists, it's cool in Reanimator lists, it's cool in sort of like weird mid-rangey to aggro lists where you actually want to have a lot of cards and just sort of spend cards very quickly. There's a lot of potential for this card, and I'm really hoping that it sees some play. Star Reader Severn. I don't think anyone was not expecting this card to get buffed. Star Reader Severn was a 2-cost 2/1. It's now a 1-cost 2/1. This puts it kind of squarely in a more aggro format, where basically you're being pretty aggressive with it early on and getting some damage pushed across, and then later in the game you can bring it back and you can use it as like a more offensive card. So there are a lot of different buttons that I would want to hit on this card, like the Exhausted ability in particular is just kind of a pain in the butt. I actually kind of want this card to be a constant blocker, since like the thing that I really want Severn to do is defend your relics. The shadow influence is obviously kind of a problem, because like bringing it back from the void is really, really hard, and you are not going to get it in Aurelian lists. I feel like nerfing the cost on this card is the one button that I don't want to hit, because it basically enforces a pretty standard linear setup where you're attacking with small units and you're getting in like a little bit of extra like inevitability later on. That's not as interesting to me as any of the other like cogs that you can play with, even if those cogs are potentially a lot more powerful in control lists and a lot more irritating in gameplay. Like, I want a big recursive card, I want Star Reader Severn to be kind of exciting, so I'm not wild about this change overall, although I do think that Star Reader Severn is competitive now, and that's because 1-cost 2/1 is actually a really good stat line, and there are quite a few like vanilla 2/1s that with like some sort of like mild upside that can be played in sort of aggro style lists, basically where just having the advantages of a 1-drop early can be really, really important. For example, Drifter is a card that you would play in Pauper Gunslinger lists, as well as in like some of my personal Gunslinger lists, where you actually get just a regular 2/1 that manages to carry hideout pistols, and that alone is enough to push the card over the top when you're trying to get a list together with just a lot of 1s and a lot of 2s and a lot of 3s. 1-drop 2/1 is a stat line that you just don't have enough of in Eternal, so this actually gives you a reason to play Severn in really aggro-focused lists where you're trying to get tons and tons of stuff out early, and then maybe play a relic or 2 later on to punish your opponent. So, like, I don't know, the Nightfall relic? There's some possibilities. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. If you want to do, like, relic weapon-focused stuff, that might be pretty cool. I would say this card still doesn't play very well with Aurelian, which is very sad. Still doesn't defend your relics, which is very sad, and still doesn't have like all that interesting of a buff when it comes back in the void, which is very sad. But it's an aggro card now, so we got that going for us. Still, it's a cool promo. It's much more competitive now, and like I actually might expect to see it in a competitive list as a result of this. Veteran Mercenary. 4 cost, 4/4. So this card creates and draws a random card of a faction, which has always been like one of my favorite things for monocolored lists. I loved playing time decks with Talir with Veteran Mercenary because Veteran Mercenary triggered draws for Talir. There's a lot of Mono Justice out on the board right now where people are playing basically Akaria and Hojin and a bunch of like the little like justice focused cards, and Veteran Mercenary fits very well into that slot now that it is significantly more cost efficient and significantly more capable of just getting you a good unit on board while also drawing you an effective card and giving you something cool to play with. This card's really fun in monocolor. I would say it's generally reasonably competitive in monocolor, and the buff to it, and this is a buff to it, is definitely going to make it much more capable of scrapping. I can't trade with a Sandstorm Titan anymore, and that's a little bit sad. Can't trade with a Vara anymore, and that's a little bit sad, but like 2 attack is really a very low price to pay for bringing this card from 5 to 4, and overall this card is just like a lot of power in monocolored lists. So try it out in Mono Shadow with Shadowlands Tyrant and other fun like triple Shadow influence cards. You can do the artifact that gives you the 5/5 mannequin. You can do some really interesting Mono Shadow aggro stuff with Veteran Mercenary at the top that can actually do some pretty cool stuff. If you're playing with Kaifus, Kaifus fits in just about anything as a 6-drop on the slot. So you can do monocolored lists where you play Mercenary and then Kaifus, and you have like maybe Mirror Image in blue. That's a really cool strategy. You can do time stuff where you do a bunch of ramping, and then Veteran Mercenary draws you cards into Talir's Destiny effect, which is really, really fun. You can do, like, there's a monocolor deck in every color that can play Veteran Mercenary, and all of them have potential to at least climb you in rank and have a little bit of fun. And they're all pretty cheap decks as well, so if you have access to Veteran Mercenary, I definitely would consider giving this card a shot in a monocolored list. So give it a shot, and yeah, it's pretty fun stuff. So some good popper tools, some good stuff where basically if you're playing with a limited amount of cards in your list, you can now do Wisp stuff, you can now do Starbeater Severn with like interesting relics, you can do monocolored lists with Veteran Mercenary, and you can play with some of your old cards if you want to do like the unseen stuff, although all of those stat buffs are legendary effects, so a little bit less of the popper stuff. Nonetheless, like we also have like all of these cool legendary toy boxes from previous sets that really just never got enough play, and they are getting really serious stat buffs that actually allow them to compete. And I think we're going to see a lot of new tier 2 lists, tier 3 lists, maybe even at least one list that can actually do something against like these win chest lists that are all over the ladder right now. I don't know if any of these are going to contribute that much to it, but I do think that the meta is going to be wild, wild west for a little bit, and there's so many fun decks to build. This is all just like really, really fun, and there's so many cool things to make. We're going to be very excited about playing with those cards, and yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. Like, I think that this is a really, really happy patch, and I'm pretty happy about it, so it seems pretty exciting. Okay, so yeah, that's it for me for today. We're gonna be working on some new projects. Got a couple of basically more edited things coming out pretty soon, so look out for those. I'm hoping to have some out by the end of the month at the very least. We'll be continuing to put up stuff every week, and at least twice a week if we can, probably much more than that if we can. I've been doing a lot more streaming because of the new influence store. We'll have some more opinions on that, I think, in the future. Thus far it's a little bit shaky, but I would say that it is a net positive for streaming overall, and it is causing me to you know, want to stream a little bit more, so we'll be talking about it a lot in a future video. I have a Patreon, you can find me on Twitch, and I'm also on Twitter, and I think that's about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was a lot of fun, and I hope you guys have fun with all of the fancy new buffs to the Eternal cards. Cheers everyone, see you next time.